screen our panelists who are coming to us from around the world. From Geneva, we'd like to welcome Dan Esty, Hillhouse Professor of Environment and Law and Policy, the Yale School of Environment and Yale Law School. Dan is on public policy leave at the World Trade Organization. From Quito, we are pleased to welcome Ecuador's Vice Minister of Production, Foreign Trade and Investment and Fisheries, Daniel Lagarda. From Paris, we are honored to host Ambassador Joe Tyndall, Director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD. From Washington, we're pleased to host David Livingston, Managing Director for Clean Energy and Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. And lastly, Kelly Milton, Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Environment and Natural Resources at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Thank you for joining us. And of course, our moderator, Maureen Hinman, who is the co-founder and chair of the Silverado Policy Accelerator and also a sponsor of WITC's Trade and Environment series. We're delighted to have the opportunity to bring all of you together virtually from around the world at the 2023 Washington International Trade Conference. Maureen?
Thanks so much, Ken. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think there are probably two words to describe this esteemed panel. Formidable. We have some of the world's leading experts in this area here today. So thank you everyone for taking time to be here. And full. We have a lot of voices and I want to get to everyone's dear thoughts on the issues. So why don't we start out with His Excellency Vice Minister Daniel Lagarda. I'm going to give everyone a chance to give kind of a 3-minute introduction, but just to start out and successively have everyone else give their views. Vice Minister, from your vantage, what are the top near-term opportunities to use trade policy to combat climate change? And by the way, I wanted to congratulate you on the recent announcement for the Trade Minister's Initiative in Climate that you're leading.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you to Ken and WITA for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be joining this panel this afternoon. So from the perspective of a developing country, I think it's important to address the problems of climate change will be also ours, and also, of course, of all the countries. So that's why we have taken an approach on the WTO work on environmental sustainability that has been intensified in the last years because of obvious reasons. And we have culminated in the launching of some important initiatives as a result of the discussion taking place under the Committee on Trade and Environment. Some of them are, for example, the dialogue on plastic pollution, the fossil fuel subsidy reform initiative, and of course, the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussions. And from these dialogues on the last MC conference last year, trade ministers from several different regions in the world, including Ecuador, from South America and developing countries, but also European Union, Kenya, and New Zealand, we all agreed to establish a coalition for trade ministers on climate. And thanks for the congratulations on this initiative. It'll be, I believe, hard work on the way forward. But this coalition is to acknowledge the nexus of trade, climate change, and take it into the next step. That will be the actions regarding this important topic. So sustainable development and international trade can and must take a positive contribution to driving down the emissions and enabling a just transition to climate neutral, resilient, and sustainable economies. This is something that we all agree on, but there are several topics to tackle and to take care of from the perspectives of trade. And I'm also glad to share with you that on January this year, earlier on January, on the site of the meeting in Davos, over 50 ministers of trade from different countries around the world launched officially the initiative of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. This is an important cornerstone forward because we have always talked about the relation between trade and climate change, but there hasn't been a joint initiative to tackle climate change from the perspective of trade. And of course, this brings a lot of a lot of challenges that we ask ourselves as well, because it's still to be clear exactly the first topics to advance on these important topics. And I'm sure some of the panels here could also propose and some conversations to take into account forward. But at least what we want to do is put forward this dialogue, to implement a high-level debate, include the academia, include governments to participate, and highlight what are the exact actions that we can do together. We have a couple of principles and actions that have been prioritized of the work done, because there's some work done, of course, both with the WTO, with United Nations, in many ways. But in this matter, the actions that have been prioritized, and to answer in part your guiding questions, will be, first of all, to foster the international cooperation and the collective action to promote trade and trade policies that pursue climate actions across the WTO and relevant multilateral and other plurilateral initiatives. Identify ways to ensure the multilateral trading system contributes to the global response to climate change. I think Angela has signaled some of them that are being working ahead. Promote trade and investment that foster the diffusion, development, accessibility, and of course the uptakes of goods and services for climate mitigation. Identify trade-related strategies to supportive of the most vulnerable and developing, least developed countries. That, of course, from our perspective, this is something also important to take into account. And build alliances and partnerships that we have already started, as I've been mentioning, with climate and finance communities and relevant stakeholders to foster the climate action, but with the trade perspective. I'll stop there, but I hope I give you a broad view about this initiative and some of the main topics that we think we're advancing together, with a lot of work to do in the upcoming months.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister. Ms. Tyndall, did you want to take off and give us your introductory comments?
Yes, thanks very much, Maureen. And really, it's a pleasure and a delight to be here joining you with this panel on climate change and trade. So thanks for organising the very timely event. I just spent a week of meetings just last week that were very much focused on climate change, and the issue of trade kept coming up. So there's no getting around it. It's abundantly clear that there are very, very strong overlaps and intersections between the two. I just wanted to begin by super quickly talking you through some of the main findings and conclusions that the work we've done at the OECD has come to on this topic, this linkage. First of all, and some of this might seem terribly obvious, climate change will have negative economic consequences. And we've estimated the damages from climate change on GDP can go up to double digits in some parts of the world. What that means, I think, is that, or what we've shown is that the negative impacts are amplified if countries don't have diversified trade patterns. So that's a truly important point. Second, trade policies tie net zero goals to the circular economy. We're hearing increasingly about the need for critical raw materials, for example, and in order to support the transition to a carbon neutrality or net zero. So trade can also help secure economies of scale for critical materials to be recycled and support the transition to a circular economy. Next point, strong regulation in favour of the environment can pay off. We've done studies that show that countries will be larger exporters of environmental products when they have robust environmental regulations in place. And a last couple of points to note. We've been talking for a number of years about reform of fossil fuel subsidies or support for fossil fuels. That requires absolutely urgent action. And the OECD, as you may know, tracks fossil fuel support in 51 countries. And unfortunately, as energy prices rose, we saw fossil fuels support almost doubling from 360 billion US dollars in 2020 to just under 700 billion US dollars in 2021. And the last thing in terms of lessons we've learned is that regional trade agreements can be a tool to promote environmental objectives between trading partners. And we're now seeing at least 212 RTAs include climate-related provisions. So that can play a role for like-minded countries to further their ambitions and support capacity building in developing countries. Now, just to finish, I wanted to turn your question a little bit on its head and ask, how can combating climate change help trade policy? Because I think one of the things we know and understand is that there is a huge diversity of transitioning to low carbon economies. Countries are taking widely and wildly different approaches. And while that is the case, there is a risk of in terms of WTO, trade disputes, et cetera, and concerns about equivalence. So how do we avoid shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic, if I can use that analogy? And one of the meetings I was involved in last week was the launch of the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, an OECD project that aims to support countries or support governments to enhance policy design and effectiveness. Now, what I think the risks and threats to both climate goals and to trade will be much reduced if we do three things. First, we're all taking action that is clearly aligned with Paris Agreement goals. Second, we have improved data and understanding about the range of mitigation approaches being taken. At the moment, that data is really patchy. And third, we can use peer learning to encourage best practice, good policy making that is likely to produce the fastest and most effective results in reducing emissions. And that's the philosophy, if you like, behind that inclusive forum that was launched. And very much the WTO trade side of things was permeating the discussion at that launch. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Assistant USTR, Kelly Milton. I thought I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. I was having some technological challenges earlier, so glad I can be heard. Thank you. So thank you. Just to add some thoughts and perspectives, I mean, we certainly have a very busy agenda on the trade and environment and the trade and climate front these days. And there are many opportunities to use trade policy to combat climate change, both directly and indirectly. And so, for example, in addition to the work that we are undertaking in the WTO to continue to push a proactive and engaging dialogue among members on core issues around trade and climate change, we're also working through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework trade pillar, and we'll be pursuing these issues with IPEF partners as well. We hope that these and other efforts will help spur trade policy decision-making that aligns with climate goals, as well as creates enabling investment environments and governance structures countries reach their climate goals. We're also in the midst of our negotiations with the EU on a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, which we believe will be a first of its kind agreement to really focus in on emissions intensity of traded goods in these sectors. We envision that this will be a direct use of trade policy affecting climate change and hopefully provide a future example in how we might look at bigger questions around how to account for carbon intensity in traded goods. We also continue to prioritize issues such as combating illegal logging and associated trade, illegal fishing, wildlife trafficking, all of which have indirect climate effects. And this is all with a view to ensure that illegally harvested natural resources do not enter our supply chains, and that we do not disadvantage U.S. workers and businesses who use lawful and sustainable means to make their goods. We're also thinking about ways to identify and then facilitate trade in environmental goods and technologies that have an important impact on climate mitigation and adaptation. And this includes taking a look at the non-tariff barriers that may limit trade of these goods. And I just wanted to echo something that Ambassador Tyndall just noted, which is the need to pursue circular economy approaches and to find climate solutions through the circular economy. And so we're certainly prioritizing that as well and see a lot of potential there too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I was just trying to jot down all the wonderful things you're saying fast, so I can come up with clever questions later. Now I'd love to turn to Mr. David Livingston, a senior advisor to John Kerry and energy expert at the White House.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And thanks to you, to Silverado, to WITC for hosting this excellent discussion. It reminds me that sometimes you get to a point where everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. So let me take my best shot at repeating some of the excellent points that that have been made. No, but it's simply to say that it's refreshing. There's such alignment across, frankly, the administration, from USTR to the Office of Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Kerry, to to our Commerce Department and elsewhere, about our general approach on integrating climate and environmental priorities, not just concerns, but also opportunities, into our trade policy and into the way that we're approaching our economic statecraft. I want to highlight, maybe let me just add, in addition to everything else that's been mentioned, a couple of areas where, again, we're not just viewing this about how do we solve the problem or the challenge of climate change, but also how do we fully harness the opportunity of clean energy transition for ourselves and for multiple other economies. One of the great examples of that, I think, is also in the economic framework agreements that are being worked out at the moment between the United States and several countries in the Indo-Pacific and in the broader Indo-Pacific economic region through something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, as well as what we're doing similarly with the Latin America region through the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Both of these have key elements to them, key foci of both of these agreements that are focused, again, not on climate change as such, but on clean economy and on really harvesting the opportunities and working to create a growing market and an attractive market that attracts inbound investment into clean energy technologies, into decarbonization opportunities, not just in the energy sector, but also in sectors that are oftentimes actually do not receive the same amount of inbound capital, do not receive the same amount of innovation capital as some of these other sectors. So things like agriculture, things like heavy industry, things like long distance transport. How do we create conditions that are conducive to, but policy, regulatory, and market environments that are conducive to attracting investment that can help to drive down emissions in these sectors, but critically drive down emissions through scaling up clean energy technologies and innovative technologies, whether that be new low carbon methodologies for steel making or for aluminum smelting or for cement and concrete production, or whether that be novel sustainable aviation fuels that can help to reduce the emissions associated with flight, or new sustainable shipping fuels and the bunkering infrastructure necessary to facilitate these green shipping corridors that the world is increasingly starting to talk about. These are some of the topics that have received a great amount of focus in these new economic framework agreements that we're working on. And frankly, when you think about how these complement some of the work that's going on in other areas like Kelly noted on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum trade. When you think about, just generally what we are doing to try and reduce barriers to trade, including technical barriers to trade or non-tariff barriers for clean and green goods, all of these go together in a way where hopefully what we're doing is we're creating a virtuous political economy. I mean, you see this in what we've done in the Inflation Reduction Act, a recognition that deployment of clean energy is not just enough. We also want to put in place measures that support manufacturing and a diversified set of clean energy value chains and clean energy manufacturing activities, where there are no bottlenecks and there's these value chains are not, let's say, at the mercy of any one single actor, any one single country or region. So as we do this, ultimately, what a co-benefit of that as well is not just ensuring the security or the long-term durability of the clean energy transition from a supply chain security perspective, but it also means that from a political economy perspective, it becomes more attractive as well. When you start to diversify these manufacturing opportunities, when you start to diversify these supply chains, it means that the next marginal clean energy deployment, the next 10% of the grid that goes green in a given country, is generating jobs in that country and among its friends and partners in a way that can actually propel the transition forward, rather than exacerbating some of the, let's say, the kind of just transition tensions that we've sometimes seen when too many of these supply chains are located or captured by one single country, one single entity. So I just wanted to thread together some of the different elements that are tying all this together. From a climate perspective, we think that these things are all inextricably intertwined. You cannot accelerate the clean energy transition without secure clean energy supply chains. You cannot create a political foundation for an accelerated transition without shared prosperity and job creation. And that is at the heart of what we're doing here across multiple different fora and multiple different regions in our approach.
Well, thank you. That I got really excited just now. I think that's very inspirational, and hopefully collectively we can get some of this important work done. I know our next panelist spends a lot of time thinking about exactly that, as well as the institutional arrangements that need to be there, so we can all grow green together. Dr. Dan Esty, currently on leave at the WTO. What are your thoughts?
Maureen, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this WITC conversation. And I think as a number of your panelists have already made clear, and I think as Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala stressed in her presence at COP28, the climate conversation in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, trade really should be understood as a critical point of leverage for climate change action. And I think you've heard already tonight a number of reasons why. And let me just add three more points or stress 3 points of how trade can positively contribute, and then highlight one negative that I think we really want to avoid. First of all, as you've heard, and I think as Rufus Yerxa made clear in his conversation with Deputy Director General Ellard, it's very clear that there are opportunities to disseminate clean energy technologies, clean energy projects at speed and scale if we have trade working to reinforce the global community's commitment to climate change action. And that could take the form of an environmental goods agreement potentially, or an environmental goods and services agreement. I think there's potential there. It has to overcome some barriers, political barriers, as you've heard, but this is, I think, a big opportunity. Second, I think it has long been the case, sometimes forgotten, but it shouldn't be, that trade has been of value for driving innovation, for spurring fresh thinking, for disseminating new technologies, but not just technologies, ideas, policies, breakthroughs in finance for clean energy and clean energy projects. And we really do need the trading system to play that critical role of pushing ideas out across the world. Third, I think there is a growing recognition that countries are going to need to enhance their nationally determined contributions, their national climate change action plans, and every country should be invited to build into their program a trade section or a trade chapter. And I think there is already available support for that kind of addition. The Trade and Environment Division at the WTO has developed a set of best practices that countries could draw from that would allow them to say, here's how we're going to use trade policy to really push our climate change program. By the way, for the broader set of ideas around how trade is working to really drive climate change progress, I'd steer people to the most recent World Trade Report, the WTO Signature Research Project, which for 2022 focused on trade and climate change. And an enormous amount of evidence is there supporting the idea that trade can be a very positive force for climate change action. And let me just close with a quick negative to be avoided. I think one of the things you've seen Director General Ngozi stressing in every talk she gives about trade and climate change is the risk of fragmentation. Economic fragmentation could well result in less than cooperative behavior on the critical issue of climate change or sustainability more broadly. And that would be difficult. In delivering global public goods, including climate change action, it's really necessary to pull the whole global community together. And that means that we need trade cooperation in support of climate change action. And I think we're seeing that begin already. Ambassador Tyndall stressed how we need to pull people together to look at the divergent approaches to climate change action, to climate change structures of policy, and find ways to integrate those, make them interoperable. And I do think that work, which the OECD is leading and really launched the effort last week with 100+ countries thinking together, is going to be fundamental to avoiding this downside of breaking people apart, resulting in fragmentation, not only on climate change, but more broadly, or not only more broadly on economic issues, but as a result on climate change as well.
Thanks so much, Dan. Well, one enduring theme that I think all the panel has spoken to really elegantly is the idea that in this climate change fight, we need a rapid uptake of technology and a lot of technological transfer. The critical link, of course, is trade, which funnels finance into hard capital and ideas that can move across borders. So with that in mind, I've heard several panelists discuss some of the challenges, which include not just tariff barriers, but also some technical barriers that present themselves in this space. So I'd like to put it out to the panel. What do you think is the most pressing barrier to remove? And do you have any ideas on approaches either individual countries can take or institutions?
Well, Maureen, I'd like to jump in with a short one on this one. And again, it's not just because I'm representing here the coalition of trade ministers for climate, but I think the joint initiatives and the put together of joint objectives is the first step and the necessary step. As you mentioned, and the panelists have also shown, there's many challenges to overcome, and of course, different positions from different countries around the world on specific subjects. But on this first important tipping point, changing point of bringing together countries from different regions that have different interests, but overcoming these and putting together an effort of saying climate change is something that is there, and we need to take this also from the perspective of trade and put together not the differences, but what can bring us together in terms of the solutions. And of course, there's a broad range of the discussions that should be having there, but I believe we're all part of the problem and should be all part of the solution as well. The most brilliant minds in the world regarding trade and climate are going to be needed on this effort and participate in this important space that has been created under the coverage of the WTO and under the guidance, you would say, of a multilateral system. That should be also an interesting one to look forward, also for the challenges of the WTO. But this is the first step, I would say, to challenge to tackle these problems from a joint point of view and a joint perspective. It should not be an easy work, but again, it's something that we are entitled to do, definitely all the countries together.
Thank you, Vice Minister. If I may, I have a question for Auster Milton. First of all, congratulations on implementation to USMCA. It appears to me that in this discussion, we also are looking for novel ideas in the trade policy space to help combat climate change. And the USMCA contains a technical chapter on both reducing and harmonizing energy performance standards across North America. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the value of these types of provisions to climate change and whether it serves as a model in other approaches moving forward.
Kelly, we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry. See, the technical challenges are real. So as I was saying, thank you, Maureen, for the question. I mean, certainly we do see value in these types of provisions and these types of approaches. And again, it really shows that trade can serve as a leverage point, that we can work together to tackle some of these issues. As I was noting in my earlier remarks, like one of the areas that we're pursuing, for instance, in the IPEF trade pillar is really around how we can look to help create, enabling investment environments and governance structures, and really encourage all of us to in a way, reach our climate goals. And so we certainly see a lot of opportunity here. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. And now, Joe, I just a quick question. The OECD is an organization that is a thought leader on many issues related to the circular economy, but it's also an organization that governs binding agreements for circular economy products. If you had a wish list of the types of approaches the world could take on circular economy and trade, what would that wish list be?
That's a really tough one to kind of answer off the top of my head, Maureen. I think I'd already mentioned the fact that the question of critical raw materials, minerals in particular, is really rising up to the top of the agenda. I think one of the things we're seeing, particularly with energy price rises here in Europe, but also around the world, is a real acceleration in response to build domestic energy security. A lot of that is accompanied by kind of localized solutions, turning to renewable energy and wanting access to critical raw materials. So I touched on it briefly, but first of all, we need a diversity of supply. And we know that for many of those raw materials, they're really concentrated in one or maybe two countries in the world. It really adds to the imperative to make better use of the natural resources we have. We've just got to move away from this belief that we're in a world of boundless natural resources and start thinking about how we can use trade to better deal with the recycling, reuse, and kind of salvaging of materials that are otherwise pollutants or are critical to production. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention was it was touched on by Kelly, Milton, and that is we're focusing very much on climate change, but I think in thinking about this whole area, we've got to move to other environmental issues as well, particularly around biodiversity, but also water security, plastics pollution, and so on. And the solutions we find, which are trade related for climate change, also have to deliver nature positive solutions that take into account the importance of biodiversity and related environmental issues.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up question. It would appear to me part of the problem with circular economy is that we know where deposits are located and where mines should go, but we don't necessarily know what types of stocks we have in society, how recyclable they are, and whether and when they might be coming to end of life. Can you comment on any work the OECD might be doing to try to help crack that nut?
Yes, to some extent. Although I probably off the top of my head can't think of all the work we're doing, but we are doing a work around, for example, extended producer responsibility and what kinds of approaches to recycling are working better in what parts of the world. So there are a couple of reports that that provide some policy advice and options for in that respect. I think perhaps the other areas we've looked at which are relevant this year in particular is the UN UNEP is negotiating a new plastics treaty. Is we've done two versions of a plastics outlook and planning a regionally focused one as a follow-up to that, which is looking at Southeast Asia. So those are two just quickly off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. I wanted to go ahead and turn to Mr. Livingston. I had just a follow-up question for you on some of the barriers that your shop is concerned with, and when it comes to trying to foster this world vision you so nicely articulated.
Well, thank you, Maureen. There's no one specific policy or provision that I'll identify, but I will say I recognize that as we move from today's, not only grappling with frankly the growth and the penetration of today's mature clean energy technologies like wind, solar, et cetera, which now no longer deserve to be called alternative energy, but which are frankly the first choice energy for the vast majority of markets around the world. But we're obviously grappling with the implications of that, considering they have complex value chains across many borders, many different times. We also are getting the scale up of new emerging technologies that are being brought into commercial viability over this decade. And that includes things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, et cetera. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, and think we should all keep a close eye on, is from our perspective, we need to be as technologically inclusive, but balanced with scientific rigor as much as possible. What do I mean by that? I mean that, from a US government perspective approach, we don't like to sort of say, oh, this hydrogen came from renewables or one particular technology, but this hydrogen didn't, or this hydrogen is green or blue or turquoise, call it by a color. We would like to put in place a clear, coherent set of criteria in terms of what constitutes low carbon hydrogen or low emissions hydrogen, and to count every single hydrogen supply, hydrogen resource, according to its life cycle emissions. We should be doing that across the board for every energy technology, because at the end of the day, what really matters is not the source of the technology or this or that, but ultimately the carbon intensity, right? The life cycle emissions, the embedded emissions within the production of that energy resource across its full life cycle. And so, one thing that we should all be mindful of is trying to work to mitigate a proliferation of different standards and metrics and definitions that really don't get at what is at the heart of the matter, which is, again, the carbon intensity of the good in question, the carbon intensity or the life cycle emissions of the energy source in question. And I think if we do that, that's actually a very pro-climate way of doing things. That's a way of accelerating the contribution of trade to emissions reductions, because it says to the world and to the global trading system and to global markets, we cannot afford, we don't have time, we don't have the luxury to leave certain solutions off the table. We have to count each one, instead of calling them out, call them in, invite them in, but allow every single possible solution to be judged according to a scientifically rigorous life cycle emissions assessment. And if we do that, I think we'll create for ourselves a very fruitful platform and a common understanding across which many different countries with many different policy approaches can all work together to accelerate emissions reductions in the global trading system.
Thank you so much, David. You know, a little bit on the other side of the coin, you know, trade is really built on its own math and its own level of quantification. And, you know, I think it's an important conversation to have about how we're going to quantify and rack and stack some of these climate positive approaches. But one of the main points of debate right now is how we deal with the carbon loophole and closing border adjustments. Or closing that loophole through fair and equitable border adjustments. And there's a lot of quantification questions that go into that. I don't know if Ouster Milton or not has a little bit to say on some of the work that's occurring under the GASA, which is the world's first and most watched, I believe, discussion on this quantification for steel and aluminum products.
Sure. Thanks, Maureen. And I don't think I've heard it called the GASA before, but in any event, so yeah, we are working on the global arrangement, and it is an ongoing and active conversation. And you know, it includes addressing both the carbon intensity issue, but also the non-market excess capacity issue in the steel and aluminum sectors. And so, you know, our overarching goal with this arrangement is really to demonstrate that in practice, like we can have a new trade paradigm that takes into account carbon intensity in these particular sectors. And it's certainly not an easy lift, but it is, you know, an important one. And, you know, we are looking at this very question that you were just talking about, that David was just elaborating about, you know, embodied carbon and emissions intensity in traded goods. And so we've been having these conversations with the EU about, you know, how to lay the groundwork for measuring carbon intensity. Those conversations will continue, but, you know, it's really important in an arrangement such as this that we do seek to account for a comprehensive emissions profile. And, you know, hopefully that will be at various levels, facility level, emissions from purchased electricity going into those facilities, emissions associated with certain inputs that have high emissions intensities, so that really we can establish an accurate kind of product level emissions for traded steel and aluminum. But like I said, it's complex, and, you know, these conversations are ongoing. But hopefully will serve as an example and a model for other sectors as well to try to take account of carbon in our trading system. Thanks.
Well, the world is watching. It's extremely important work. So thank you for your service. I'd love to turn now to Dan. I know that you're doing a lot of thinking over there at the WTO on the institutional arrangements that will be necessary to meet these types of goals, as well as what types of support the WTO can lend to things like the border carbon adjustment. Just wanted to get some of your thoughts.
So let me quickly offer a few thoughts, more as a professor than as a visiting scholar at the WTO. But I do think there is a growing consensus that competitive advantage achieved by not adhering to international environmental commitments, climate change in particular, but more broadly, biodiversity as these requirements come into focus, is increasingly of concern. And I do think we owe a debt of thanks to the European Union for pushing the border carbon adjustment conversation, although I myself think there's some challenges with the approach that's being put forward. And I do think we need to dig into the details. I have argued, and for those who are interested, the long version of this, not the 20-second version, is in a piece that's about to come out in the Arizona Law Review, is available already on the Social Science Research Network. But I think there's a four-part test we should apply. Is the border carbon adjustment environmentally effective? Is it administratively workable? Is it WTO compatible? And is it politically advisable? And I think the European Union approach has some challenges really across the board on that four-part analysis. So I do think we need to drive the conversation. We need to push this forward and get into the details, as I know folks at the WTO are doing, at the OECD. And frankly, I think a growing number of members at the WTO and countries across the board are realizing this is a discussion we now need to get into the nitty-gritty.
Thank you all very much. Maureen, I'm jumping in.
I was going to say, you're going to give me the hook anyways. So
we were so grateful to all of you for joining us today. It was a big panel and we didn't have a whole lot of time, and I'm going to plead with you to let us have you back again, whether we're in person or online, depending on where you are. We had a lot of questions come in. You actually got to several of the topics, which were CBAM, and there's sort of a plea that's embedded in about 3 or 4 of the questions that are about rationalizing trade policies and industrial policies so that we are achieving our climate goals and that trade is enabling and not standing in the way of achieving our climate objectives, which I think everybody on this panel would agree with. For those of you who submitted those, I'm sorry we didn't get to have them. We had a big panel this time, but we are going to share all the questions with our panelists by email. So we will send them to them so they will see them and see who asked those. So they will see all those questions and can see the comments that are embedded in there. So thank you all very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Wherever you're coming to us from, Geneva, Paris, Washington, DC, Quito, thank you so much for joining us today.